It was worse than being trapped in an airport. Being trapped in an airport while the world watches you fall apart. For Barron Trump, a Thursday afternoon at Dallas Love Field Airport was about to become a masterclass in practiced restraint, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one wearing the badge. The air conditioning hummed overhead, its artificial chill raising goosebumps on Barron's arms, despite his Navy Yale hoodie. At 17, he had mastered the art of invisibility in public spaces, head down, shoulders relaxed, eyes fixed on his phone. A carefully crafted pose of teenage indifference that usually kept the whispers at bay. Gate C-12 buzzed with the controlled chaos of pre-boarding. A baby wailed somewhere to his left. A businessman barked into his AirPods about quarterly projections. The smell of burnt coffee from the nearby kiosk mixed with the sharp antiseptic scent that seemed embedded in every airport's DNA. Barron's fingers paused over his phone screen, hovering above a text from his mother. "Safe travels, B. Call when you land." He smiled slightly, remembering how she still checked on him, even though he'd flown solo countless times. The smile faded as a shadow fell across his screen. "Excuse me, young man." The voice carried the kind of authority that came with a clipboard and a power trip. Barron looked up, meeting the sharp-featured face of a gate agent whose badge read Gerald. The man's gray uniform was pressed to military precision, but his expression suggested he'd just caught someone trying to sneak a python through security. "Are you sure you're in the right boarding group?" Gerald's words dripped with suspicion, each syllable a tiny accusation. Barron straightened, his 6'7" frame unfolding from the priority seating area. He'd been through this dance before. The subtle questioning, the implied doubt that someone in sneakers and hoodie belonged in first class. Usually a polite response and his passport were enough to end the conversation. Barron stood back to let her and her secretary advance. "Yes, sir, I have a first-class ticket." His voice remained steady, neutral. Another practiced art. Gerald's eyes narrowed, scanning Barron's casual attire like a customs agent searching for contraband. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Pass?" The request was standard. The tone wasn't. Around them, the pre-boarding buzz began to shift. Heads turned, phones appeared. Barron felt the familiar weight of unwanted attention settling on his shoulders. "She?" Finally, a conversation appeared. He pulled up the digital boarding pass, its blue glow illuminating their faces in the fluorescent lighting. Gerald studied it with exaggerated care, his lips moving slightly as he read the name. The moment the recognition hit was visible. A slight widening of the eyes, a subtle tightening of the jaw, as motivated as if next morning he was going home. But instead of backing down, Gerald's posture stiffened. "Wait here." He turned sharply, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor as he strode toward the gate desk. Barron exhaled slowly, counting backward from 10, a technique his mother had taught him years ago. The whispers around him grew louder, more distinct. A teenager to his right was already live streaming, phone aimed not so subtly in his direction. "Is that really him? Why is he flying commercial? Something's not right." The murmurs swirled like leaves in an autumn breeze, each one carrying seeds of judgment that would soon sprout into social media speculation. Barron kept his expression neutral, but his hand tightened around his phone. He opened his weather app, pretending to check the forecast while actually watching Gerald huddle with his supervisor through his peripheral vision. They were coming back now, both of them, with the kind of purposeful walk that suggested this situation was about to escalate. The supervisor, a woman with steel-gray hair and a permanent frown, carried a tablet and an air of authority that seemed to part the crowd. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice pitched to carry just far enough to draw more attention. "There seems to be an irregularity with your ticket. We'll need you to step aside while we verify some information." Barron felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice level. "What kind of irregularity?" "Sir, please step aside." The supervisor gestured toward a nearby hallway, her tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. Around them, the crowd had grown denser. Phones recorded from every angle, their little red lights blinking like electronic eyes. A woman holding a toddler frowned, taking a step forward as if to intervene, then thought better of it. As Barron gathered his carry-on bag, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the terminal window. Behind his carefully composed expression, he saw something in his eyes that looked a lot like his mother's determination. What he didn't know was that across town, that very determination was already in motion, about to turn this airport incident into something none of them saw coming. The questioning room felt smaller with each passing minute. Barron sat at a metal table that had seen better days, his long legs cramped beneath it. 2 airport security officers stood by the door, their radios occasionally crackling with dispatches that seemed far more urgent than a teenager with a first-class ticket. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed incessantly, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look slightly ill. Barron's mind wandered to a similar incident 3 years ago at LaGuardia, though that one hadn't involved being escorted away like a criminal. His father had told him then that sometimes people's prejudices say more about them than about you. Still, knowing that didn't make this any easier. "Your passport, please." Officer Chen, the younger of the two, held out his hand. His nameplate was newly polished. His uniform still had creases from recent pressing. Everything about him screamed, "By the book." Barron unzipped his carry-on, retrieving the leather passport holder his mother had given him for his 16th birthday. The memory of that day flickered through his mind. Her smile as she'd told him it was time he had proper travel accessories, not just stuffing documents in his pockets like his father sometimes did. "This was issued in New York?" Officer Chen's question cut through the memory. "Yes." Barron kept his answers short, another lesson learned from years of public scrutiny. The less you say, the less they can twist. The second officer, Matthews, leaned against the wall, his weathered face suggesting he'd seen enough airport drama to fill several bestsellers. "Look, kid, we're just doing our jobs here. There've been some issues lately with..." "With what?" Barron interrupted, surprising himself with the edge in his voice. "With teenagers flying first class? Or with my last name?" Matthews straightened, his hand unconsciously moving toward his radio. The tension in the room thickened like storm clouds gathering before rain. Meanwhile, across town, Melania Trump's day was taking an unexpected turn. She'd planned to surprise Barron at his destination, a small gesture to make up for missing his debate tournament last week. Instead, her phone was lighting up with messages that made her blood run cold. The black SUV glided through Dallas traffic, its tinted windows concealing the storm brewing inside. Melania's finger hovered over a video link someone had sent her. The thumbnail showed her son, surrounded by security, being led away from gate C12. "Play it again," she instructed her assistant, her accent slightly thicker with concern. The shaky footage started up once more, capturing the moment the gate agent first approached Barron. With each viewing, her jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Call the airport director," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded the East Wing. "Then call our lawyer." She paused, considering her next move. "And get me Gerald Thompson's employee file." An ulterior thought. Dead wife's uncle left her more than 40 years ago. Back in the questioning room, Barron's patience was wearing thin. The officers had made 3 calls, checked his passport twice, and still acted as if they were dealing with an international incident rather than a domestic flight. "Your student ID," Officer Chen said, holding up Barron's Yale card. "It was issued this year?" "Last September." Barron fought the urge to roll his eyes. "Look, my flight's already boarding. Either arrest me or let me catch the next one." The boldness of the statement seemed to catch everyone off guard. Matthews exchanged glances with Chen, their carefully constructed procedure suddenly showing cracks. Outside the room, the airport hummed with activity, but social media was humming louder. The videos were spreading, each share adding fuel to a fire that was about to become an inferno. Comments ranged from outrage to mockery, with hashtags multiplying like bacteria in a petri dish. A knock at the door made everyone jump. The supervisor from earlier entered, her tablet now clutched like a life preserver. "We've received a call from—" She stopped mid-sentence, her face draining of color as she stared at something, or someone, behind her. The click of heels against linoleum had never sounded so ominous. In the doorway stood Melania Trump, her presence transforming the small room into what felt like a courtroom. She wore a simple black blazer and slacks, but she might as well have been wearing armor. Her eyes took in everything, her son's rigid posture, the officer's nervous shuffling, the supervisor's pallid face. "I believe," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a glacier through bedrock, "you have some explaining to do." The room fell silent, except for the persistent buzz of the fluorescent light. Officer Chen's hand dropped from Barron's passport as if it had suddenly become radioactive. Matthews straightened his spine so quickly it probably hurt. But Melania wasn't done. She pulled out her phone, the video of Barron's initial confrontation with Gerald playing silently. "Perhaps we should discuss why an employee felt empowered to harass my son in front of dozens of witnesses. Or shall we talk about profiling, discrimination? Take your pick." The supervisor stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Mrs. Trump, I assure you this is just a standard procedure." "Standard?" Melania's eyebrow arched. "Show me where in your procedure manual it says to humiliate a 17-year-old passenger without cause. I'm very interested in reading that section." The questioning room had become a pressure cooker, with Melania Trump's presence acting as the flame beneath it. She remained standing, her posture reminiscent of countless diplomatic functions where she'd learned that sometimes silence could be more powerful than words. Barron watched his mother with a mixture of relief and fascination. He'd seen this version of her before, the protective force that could scatter paparazzi with a single glance, but never quite like this. Her calm felt dangerous, like the stillness before a hurricane makes landfall. "Mrs. Trump," Matthews began, his earlier authority evaporating under her steady gaze, "there were concerns about—" "About what, exactly?" Melania's voice carried the weight of every slight, every whispered comment, every sideways glance her family had endured. "About a teenager traveling to see his debate team? About a first-class ticket purchased weeks in advance? Or, perhaps, about the way your gate agent decided my son didn't look like he belonged?" The supervisor's tablet slipped slightly in her sweaty grip. "We had received alerts about—" Eugene murmured. Confused, she reached up. "Alerts?" Melania stepped forward, her movement causing everyone else to instinctively step back. "Show me these alerts. Show me the specific protocol that justified treating my son like a security threat." Officer Chen cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we can't discuss specific security protocols." A dark-haired older woman smiled broadly, out of place in such a sentimental and kind face. "And yet here we are." "Then I suggest you call your legal department," Melania interrupted smoothly, "because my lawyers are already reviewing the footage from Gate C12, and I assure you, they're finding it very interesting." The mention of lawyers sent the supervisor scurrying from the room, her shoes squeaking against the linoleum in her haste. Through the briefly opened door, they could hear the buzz of a growing crowd outside. News traveled fast in airports, and faster still when it involved a Trump. Barron stood, his height making the small room feel even more cramped. "Mom, it's fine. I can just catch the next flight." Melania turned to her son, her expression softening for a moment. "No, it's not fine. This stops today." She faced the officers again. "You have exactly 5 minutes to either produce legitimate cause for this detention or escort us to the next available flight. First class, of course." Matthews reached for his radio, then thought better of it. "We'll need to contact our supervisor." 4 minutes now," Melania said. checking her watch with deliberate slowness. Outside the room, the airport had become a theater of whispers and recording phones. The story was already trending on 3 social media platforms, with amateur videos of Barron's initial confrontation racking up millions of views. Comments ranged from outrage to conspiracy theories, but one theme remained constant: the unmistakable smell of discrimination. Of course, knowing the Hegman, he couldn't relax without some slight respect. The supervisor returned, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who radiated corporate damage control. "Mrs. Trump," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Thomas Wheeler, Director of Airport Operations. I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" Melania's voice could have frozen Texas in July. "Your staff publicly humiliated my son, detained him without cause, and you call it an inconvenience?" Wheeler's practiced smile faltered. "I assure you, we take these matters very seriously. Not seriously enough to prevent them, it seems." Melania's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at it, her expression hardening. "Your gate agent, Gerald Thompson, has quite an interesting history of random selections for additional screening. Would you like to know what my team just found in his employment records?" The color drained from Wheeler's face. Behind him, the supervisor looked like she wanted to melt into the wall. "Mom," Barron said quietly, recognizing the steel in her voice. He'd seen that look before. Right before she'd dealt with a particularly aggressive member of the press who'd gotten too close to him at a school event. The reporter had found himself blacklisted from every major media outlet within a week. Melania placed a hand on her son's shoulder, but her eyes remained locked on Wheeler. "Here's what's going to happen. First, you're going to escort us to the next flight. Then you're going to address everyone who witnessed this incident. Finally, you're going to demonstrate exactly how your airport plans to prevent this kind of profiling in the future." Wheeler swallowed hard. "Of course, Mrs. Trump. We can arrange private boarding." "No," she cut him off. "No private anything. You made this public. The apology should be too." Her gaze swept the room, landing on each person in turn. "After all, transparency is crucial for building trust, isn't it?" The irony of her words wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Security cameras had captured every moment of Barron's detention, and those videos would soon tell their own story. The question was whether the airport would control the narrative or be controlled by it. The walk back to Gate C-12 felt like a procession. Melania and Barron Trump led the way, followed by Wheeler, the supervisor, and both security officers. The crowd parted before them like waves breaking against a ship's bow. The clicking of phones and whispered conversations created a soundtrack of modern public scrutiny. Barron caught his reflection in the terminal windows. His father's height, his mother's composure. For years he'd tried to fade into backgrounds, to be just another face in the crowd. Now, watching his mother navigate this chaos with graceful fury, he wondered if maybe it was time to stop hiding. At the gate, the crowd had swollen to include passengers from neighboring gates, airport staff, and what appeared to be at least one news crew. Gerald, the gate agent who'd started it all, stood rigid behind the counter, his earlier confidence replaced by the look of someone who'd just realized he'd lit a match in a room full of gasoline. Wheeler stepped forward, clearing his throat. The microphone squealed briefly before settling into a low hum. "Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please." The terminal fell into an expectant hush. Melania's hand found Barron's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes. Pride, protection, power. A passenger was wrongfully delayed and questioned due to assumptions that have no place in our airport or our society, Wheeler continued, his corporate polish cracking under the weight of the moment. "To Mr. Barron Trump and Mrs. Trump, we offer our deepest apologies." A woman in the crowd, the same one who'd held the toddler earlier, spoke up. "What about the rest of us? How many others have been profiled who didn't have someone powerful enough to fight back?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Melania stepped forward, her presence drawing all eyes. When she spoke, her accent carried the weight of someone who knew what it meant to be judged by appearances. Perhaps it was always expectations. "This is not just about my son," she said, her voice carrying naturally without the microphone. "This is about dignity, about respect. Every person who walks through these gates deserves to be treated with the same consideration, regardless of their name, appearance, or status." Sally smiled and took her seat. She turned to Gerald, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Your actions today revealed something broken in the system. But systems can be fixed if people are willing to acknowledge the problem." Wheeler jumped in, perhaps sensing a chance at damage control. "We will be implementing immediate changes to our training programs and review procedures." "Actions, not words," Melania interrupted smoothly. "My legal team will be following up to ensure these changes happen." She paused, surveying the crowd. "And I encourage anyone who has experienced similar treatment to come forward. Change requires courage. From all of us." Barron watched as phones recorded every word, knowing this moment would be dissected across social media within hours. But for once, he didn't mind being in the spotlight. Sometimes visibility wasn't just about being seen. It was about being heard. As they finally boarded their flight, Barron settled into his first-class seat, his mother beside him. The cabin crew moved with exaggerated efficiency, perhaps aware that their every move would be remembered and reported. "You didn't have to do all that," he said quietly, as they taxied toward the runway. Melania turned from the window, her eyes softening. "Yes, I did. Because you are my son, but also because sometimes the right moment chooses us. We either rise to it or let it pass." The plane lifted into the Texas sky, leaving behind an airport forever changed by a mother's determination and a son's quiet dignity. Below them, social media exploded with hashtags and video clips. But the real story wasn't in the viral moments or trending topics. It was in the quiet conversations that would follow in break rooms and boardrooms, in the subtle shifts in policy and perspective, in the way one moment of standing up could inspire others to do the same. As Dallas Love Field faded into the distance, Barron pulled out his phone, opening his debate team's group chat. They'd been discussing civil rights and public accountability for next week's tournament. He smiled slightly, thinking how theory and practice sometimes collided in unexpected ways. "Mom," he said, putting his phone away, "remember when you told me that respect isn't given with titles but earned through actions?" "Huh?" Melania nodded, her hand finding his in the space between their seats. "I think I understand now," he continued. "It's not just about earning respect. It's about demanding it for others too." The setting sun painted the clouds in shades of gold and purple, a backdrop to a day that had started with discrimination but ended with determination. Sometimes the most powerful messages aren't delivered through grand speeches or policy changes, but through small moments of courage that ripple outward, touching lives far beyond their original impact. And in Seat 2A of Flight 1157, Barron Trump realized that sometimes the best way to honor your name isn't by hiding from it, but by using it to open doors for others who might not have a voice as loud as yours.